Hello. Thank you for joining us here today for our conversation commemorating Black History Month with Shellye Archambeau, who is a former Silicon Valley CEO, board member, and also the author of Unapologetically Ambitious: Take Risks, Break Barriers, and Create Success on Your Own Terms. And I've read it and highly recommend it. And Joe Hurd, a venture capitalist and board director, for a conversation on accelerating board diversity. To begin, I want to do a little context setting. The last year has been a time of rapid evolution on this topic. Catalyst is a member of the Alliance for Board Diversity, and in the 2021 Missing Pieces report released last June, it reported that in 2020, 36%, more than 1/3 of Fortune 500 board seats were from underrepresented groups, women and people of color. But there was even better news in 2021. According to Spencer Stuart, nearly half, 47% of new directors in the S&P 500 were people of color, and 43% were women. Together, directors from historically underrepresented groups accounted for 72% of all new directors. And 1/3 were Black African Americans in 2021, 3 times more than in 2020, which was 11%, and the most since Spencer Stuart began tracking this data in 2008. And women of all races have made gains. They now account for 27% of all directors, up from 24%. But some executives say corporate boards continue to overlook qualified people of color. So with that, I'd like to welcome Shellye and Joe into our conversation. So Joe, let's start with you. About the current environment for corporate boards, what's the landscape if you're Black and looking to serve on a corporate board today?
Sure. First, Lorraine, thanks to you and the entire Catalyst team for inviting me today. And Shellye, it's always a pleasure to share a stage with you. It's really great that this week marks the 50th anniversary of Patricia Roberts Harris being the first Black woman to serve on a public company board of directors, IBM in 1971. So this is a particularly timely conversation. Turning to your question, there could not be a better time to be interested in board service. Board chairs, CEOs, search firms, people are willing to expand the definition of what's qualified. No longer do you have to be a CEO with a $100 million P&L. They're looking at sectors like technology, cyber, HR, supply chain, procurement, international experience. If you're a general counsel or CHRO or chief procurement officer or someone who's below C-level but interested and capable, this is your time. But that being said, and Lorraine, you mentioned it in some of your stats, we still have a ways to go, right? When you look at some of the slates for these board roles, they're not as broad as they could be. We're still seeing a slight preference for people that have current board experience. Board seats may be increasing, but there is still a lack of diversity in board leadership. When you think about board chairs or audit nom chairs, that's still lagging in terms of ethnic representation. And of course, while we give a lot of scrutiny to public company boards, there are 2 times as many private equity-backed companies and 3 times as many venture-backed companies. And all of those companies have boards too, and they're not as diverse as we'd like them to be. So we still have a ways to go, but it's a great time right now.
So Joe, what is accounting for this increase? What's driving it?
So, I think there are a lot of drivers. In no particular order, you've had a concerting effort by NASDAQ and other listing agencies, investors like BlackRock and Vanguard, state legislatures in California, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, the proxy advisory firms like Glass Lewis and ISS, investment banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and of course, company stakeholders like customers and employees. All of them are have their shoulders to the grindstone. They're pushing for public companies to add at least 1 diverse director, and in many cases 2, right? And expanding diversity to include not just gender and race, but also sexual orientation. But I don't think you can discuss board diversity without discussing diversity in companies' management and employee bases, right? Yes, you've got an uptick in board seats, but this is from a pretty low base. Black employees are 12% of entry-level positions and only 6% of executive roles, White employees are 59% of entry-level positions and 76% of executive roles. So if we start getting more Blacks and women in executive roles, you'll start to see more board candidates. It's a pretty simple equation as far as I'm concerned.
If I could just add,
Joe,
Lorraine, can I just add a point to that?
Absolutely.
This is something that it's not like we woke up a couple of years ago and said, oh, this is important, let's focus on this. We've been talking about diversity for a long time. But what has really changed, and Joe shares it with the stats, right, and with the groups, is that really for the first time, investors care. And that's really where the power is when it comes to companies, whether you're talking private, public, or PE. So now we have public investors caring and making their desires known, and we're seeing action taken. If we want to drive the same behavior in the venture community, the PE community, we've got to see the same focus by PE investors and by venture investors. Because companies want to make sure that they're not only delivering the returns for investors, but they're also meeting their expectations of how they expect, right, companies to run and to operate.
And I think investors care because the results are better with more diversity. And I think exactly also right. Because their investors are demanding it. We have a change in values in the population, in the people who are, everyday people who are investing, whose monies are in pension funds. And we're seeing that more broadly, I believe, in what people are asking for out of work, more meaning and purpose in work, more diversity in their, so, it's a great time to do this. And let me, I'm sorry, Joe, go ahead.
And just picking up on Shellye's point, it's not just, the Larry Finks and the BlackRocks and the Vanguards of the world, but it's also when you look at NASDAQ and the new listing rules and the SEC providing that disclosure to investors, right? So that even individual investors can get this information and then make a decision as to whether they want to buy the stock or not. There certainly is a big push in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Shellye, this brings me to talk a little about you. Now, I know you for over 20 years, and you've been serving on boards for over 20 years, which is very impressive. In Silicon Valley, and we know that's not an easy place to be a woman of color. So can you talk a little bit about your journey? How did you accomplish this? How has the environment changed? What have been some of the challenges on your journey? I know that people would like to hear your story.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Lorraine. And I've been looking forward to this conversation. I aspired from a young age, actually, to one day run a company, and I wanted to do it in tech. So I was moving for my career with CEO as my target and my objective. And it had to be in my early 30s where I realized there was something called a board of directors. And the board of directors hires and fires the CEO. And I thought, oh, well, I want that job. So that's when I decided that, okay, after I become CEO, I want to go sit on a board of directors as well. So my career journey with regards to those roles was really very intentional. Because back then, and I started working in tech in the early 80s. So back then, there just weren't a lot of people that looked like me, or like Joe, or even like you, Lorraine, right, sitting on public boards. And I figured, all right, the odds aren't in my favor. So I'm going to figure out how I have to improve my odds. So what are the skills they look for? What are the experiences they look for? Right? How do people get these roles? And I just became super intentional about making sure that I was building the skills and the experience, but also, frankly, networking and letting people know who were in and around boardrooms that I was interested and what value I could offer. So it was, frankly, a lot of work and a lot of intention when I got my first board seat. The good news is today, as we just talked about earlier, the dynamics have changed a little bit. Not only do you need to be intentional, absolutely. But the good news is there's now a whole force that's actually doing more pulling, right? More pulling through in terms of the overall pipeline. So that has changed. Does that mean it's easy? No. Realize there are only a set of board seats, and it is something that's absolutely competitive. So it's important that if you're interested in serving on a board, whether it's a private company, public company, PE-backed, that you understand what kinds of skills and experiences CEOs and other board members want around the table, and that you're building those skills and gaining those experiences so that you have the opportunity to serve. And then networking is so important. Make sure that people around you who are in and around boards know who you are, know what you offer, and know what you can add, right, in the overall boardroom. All those things matter. Because trust me, getting on the board is the first step. Then you've got to figure out how you actually are a good board member. And trust me, being on board is different from being an operating executive.
Well, you actually said that there's lots of difference even in the interviewing process. What's the mindset that someone has to have to, think about, what board service is really about? I think a lot of people aspire to be on public boards and they don't really know what that really means. And is it something that's actually going to be suit them? And what do they really bring to the party? So, maybe you can demystify that a bit and give some perspective on how you have to think about it.
Definitely. When you're an operating executive, you're responsible for making things happen. I mean, you actually get your hands dirty. When you sit on a board, your job is not to execute. That's management's job. Your job is to make sure that the company has a strategy that will deliver the right returns to the shareholders, that they have a management team that can actually deliver on the strategy, and that they're executing against that strategy in ways that are consistent with rules, with laws, mandates, and with what the overall community and society would expect, right? So your job is much more of an advisor, of a governance provider, and of a representative to the shareholders in general. So you're not hands-on at all. What you need to do is to figure out how to exert influence through questioning, through support, right? Through kind of opening apertures and windows, helping companies see around corners and blind spots.
The classic aphorism. Go ahead, Lorraine.
Go ahead, Joe. I actually want to ask a question. There's lots of different boards. There's large public boards. There's pre-public boards. There's private equity boards. There's family businesses, and each one of them requires a bit of a different skill set. Joe, and Shellye, maybe you can comment on the differences, because I think the audience should understand that we're not all targeted to be on the board of Verizon. There's lots of opportunities. There's even nonprofit and government boards. So, Joe, do you have any thoughts? Because you've been recently on your journey and on a variety of boards, to maybe comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Lorraine. Really, depending on the size of the company, whether the company is family-owned or public or private, will dictate the sorts of expertise that they need in the boardroom. For example, in Silicon Valley, where I'm based, a lot of early stage private companies, what they're really looking for from their board members is advice on strategy, or advice in being more of a functional board member, being able to enter into new markets, bringing relationships that you might have with potential partners or funders. So you're much closer to the working, the operations of the company, being a board member of an early stage company. That's slightly different than the advice that Shellye gave you earlier, but these are also smaller, earlier stage companies, right? However, contrasting for larger public companies, they may be looking for you for a particular expertise that you have in governance. So if you have financial expertise, you might sit on an audit committee. If you have a broad set of relationships, you might sit on nominations and gov, right? So there, one of the key skills that a director needs to bring for a public company, as Shellye mentioned, is to have your nose in, but your fingers out, right? Really to provide constructive challenge to management, make sure that they're operating consistent with the overall strategy of the company and in sync with the goals of all of the stakeholders, but you're not as involved in the operations as you might be perhaps in an early stage company. And then family-owned companies have their own sets of dynamics, obviously depending on the family. But what you'll see is often there'll be different desires for corporate governance and the level of corporate governance, depending on the size and stage of the company.
Shellye, you have any comments on this, or thoughts on this question?
I completely agree. People talk about different types of board work, and I always advise people that you don't have to start initially with here's a public board. Nonprofit boards are great places to start. Now, are they different? Absolutely. But you will learn about governance on a nonprofit board. You'll learn about dynamics in a boardroom, about how can you be effective, et cetera. The requirements are different. Nonprofits typically need people who will bring resources. That's both financial as well as time, expertise, and experience. And they count on it. And then, as Joe said, the next one is you get to growing startups. They definitely count on their board members to help them, right, and support them in the overall process. And as you get larger and more mature, you have the resources within management to do it. It becomes much more around oversight.
And the
I
important
think
thing to remember
everyone,
with
it's
any,
important to interest. I'm sorry, go ahead, Joe.
no problem. I think it's such a fascinating topic. I think the important thing to remember, just building on what Shellye said, is with any board that you join, especially nonprofit boards, you're expanding your network, right? You're getting to work closely with 5 or 7 or 9 or 11 other people that might have their own networks in the community or the sector in which you're involved, and that'll help. But you're also learning, as a director, you're learning how to be collegial, right? And that's not necessarily get along to go along, but it is to have a good interplay, adding your ideas, making your thoughts known, and being influential in a group of people as opposed to solely as an individual like you might have as an operating executive.
These are all such good points for people to really introspect on why they're getting on a board, where they bring their skills, what they want to get out of the experience. And another point I want to bring up that really relates to what Joe mentioned earlier is, boards are looking more broadly for skills. They aren't just looking for CEOs anymore because we live in such a complex world. They're looking for tech talent, marketing talent, and that broadens the aperture and the pool that they can fish in. And also you thinking about what skills you really bring, which allows you to get on boards that have those unique, set of skills. Boards are doing more skills matrices that really identify what do they want. I mean, I'm on a public board. I know I've led the effort to move in that direction, and that may seem, commonplace, but as you get into smaller boards, they don't actually have those practices, but it's a real opportunity for all of you thinking about getting on your first board to think about what those skills are and then market yourself for those.
And in fact, your skills, more than your title, might be your path in the boardroom, right? When you look at just the nature of challenges that confront public company boards today, right? Whether it's cyber or international expansion or problems with the supply chain, as we've seen during this pandemic, people that are below C-level that have that subject matter expertise might find, or if they're an HR exec, right, issues with the company's employee base, they might find that substantive expertise is their path into the boardroom over and above just having a C in front of their title.
So, and before we continue, I want to remind our audience that I'm here with board directors Shellye Archambeau and Joe Hurd, and we're talking about accelerating board diversity. So, let's continue this conversation. And Shellye, let's talk about, how you drive a diverse board strategy in the boardroom. Is it the responsibility of the chair, the nom and gov, head of nom and gov? How do they drive with intentionality and why would they make this a priority?
Great question. And the answer is, it's really everybody's role. And frankly, when you look at companies, you have a chair of a board and you've got the CEO. And really the CEO and the chair, they're not the same person. Together really set the tone for the board of directors. So when you talk about where's the leadership and where's the focus, it needs to start there. But the chair of Nom and Gov, and oh, by the way, I chair 3 Nom and Gov committees for public companies. That's the role that has the responsibility to truly execute on the overall mandate and intention. And it goes back to the point that you raised, Lorraine. Companies, a well-run company today for their board has a skills matrix. They look at what's the strategy of the company. Based upon the strategy, what are the skills that we need on the board to be able to help us be as great as we can be in terms of how we execute and how we go to market. And when I say skills, I'm using skills in a very generic term. Skills can be experiences, background, right? So skill is a generic word. And what you want to do is to build a board that has a variety and a broad range of skills, backgrounds, experience. Because studies have shown, and Lorraine hinted on this earlier, over and over and over again, studies show, the more diverse team you bring, I don't care whether it's at the board level, the executive level, the operating, executing level, the more diversity you have, the better the overall results. So if you're a company that is trying to win, right, and trying to deliver outsized returns for your shareholders, you want to make sure you've got the best team. And building the best team means you want to build a diverse team. So I feel that the actual execution on the strategy really sits on the head, if you will, of the nom-gov chair, because they are driving the overall process by which we identify and select new board members and recommend them to the full board.
So let me just follow up on this also, because, in Nom and Gov, you're also responsibility for looking at governance oversight. So there's an increased focus and accountability on human capital, on DEI measures. What should the role be of, the board in overseeing that effort within the company that they're overseeing?
The board absolutely has a role to oversee, and depending upon the structure of the board, that can occur within the scope of the nominating governance committee, or it can be done by the entire board itself. So each organization, right, structures it slightly differently. But to me, it's part of the ESG, it's part of the S in terms of what it is that we're doing. So just like we look at other metrics, whether they're financial metrics, operating metrics, we need to make sure we're also looking at metrics as it relates to DEI. And frankly, a metric is meaningless unless it has a target. So we have targets for revenue, we have targets for margin, we have targets, right, for headcount, we have targets for all kinds of things. And we should have targets with regards to DE&I. And that way the metrics that we look at, we're able to compare and contrast to what our expectations are of ourselves, of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So on the boards I serve on, we actually review this information on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Joe, do you have anything to add to this perspective?
I did, just a slight tweaking or add. I think Shellye was absolutely spot on that the CEO and board chair need to be aligned and need to be intentional about driving diversity. And she was also spot on recognizing that the importance of the non-gov chair. Investors have picked up on this as well, right? When you look at Glass Lewis and ISS, they've now said that they're going to start withholding votes from non-chairs if those boards are not diverse. And withholding votes from the entire nominations and gov committee, all the directors on that committee, if boards aren't diverse. So investors are paying close attention to what's happening in the boardroom and what these non-gov chairs are doing. And the other point I want to add, and it's just a small point, but it's important. There's a lot of talk about diversity in the boardroom, but there also needs to be an equal amount of discussion around inclusion, right? Diversity gets people in the door. Inclusion keeps people in the room and feeling like they're fulfilled and participating. That's part of the reason why the focus on inclusion, there's a lot of movement around not just taking one diverse director, but taking two, right? MIT, the folks at Sloan did a study and said that they were looking at technology directors on boards. And once you have 3 directors with a tech background, those directors can be influential in moving the tech agenda within the boardroom. The same logic applies with issues of diversity, racial and gender diversity, right? So really don't take your eye off of the inclusion ball. It's not just about getting these directors in the boardroom, but making sure that people are welcomed and feel able to contribute and feel positive about being in the room once they're there.
Absolutely. We're starting to get some questions from the audience. So we have a great one here. What can leaders do to make sure the pipeline to getting on boards is open for women and people of color? And this relates to what we talked about, the broadening the pool. So Joe, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that leaders can do, right? First of all, if you're leading your own organization, take the time to identify the diverse talent that you have in your org and give them opportunities to shine, right? I can't tell you the number of CEOs that have said to myself and friends of mine, I want to see you on a board, nonprofit board, public company board, what have you, but take the time to build that into their career objectives and send the message that board service is a valued part of their own career development, right? The second is to, and Shellye mentioned this earlier, expand your network, have an expansive network, and keep on adding to it, right? Don't wait until you have an opening to run around and then compile a list of diverse talent. If you need to find somebody in 6 weeks and you're on a short fuse, you're going to start seeing the same names pop up on these board lists over and over again. I'm on 2 boards that are going to be adding directors in the next year. I use the notes function on my iPhone. Every time I keep a running list of people that I come across. Whenever I hear somebody on a panel or see someone quoted in the newspaper or someone comes recommended to me, I keep them on a list. And when it's time, I present the list to my non-gov chair, to my board chair. But you have to be very intentional about constantly looking for talent and giving opportunities to the folks in your own organization to shine and push board service on them as well.
All right, the other thing, which is just taking it a step further. People talk about mentoring people and helping and support, which is all good. But I'm a big believer in sponsorship. And the difference between mentoring and sponsorship is mentoring is reactive. Somebody comes to you for advice, counsel, support, right? But a sponsorship is proactive, where you basically say, okay, you identify a couple of key talented people within your organization and you make it happen, right? You work to actually open doors, to make key introductions, right? To get it is a proactive action. And I think more leaders need to consciously look for people who don't look like them to actually sponsor. And if we did more of that, we'd see a stronger pipeline.
Absolutely. And,
I could not
in
agree with you more,
Catalyst talks
Shellye.
about sponsorship a lot. You can read on the Catalyst website all about sponsorship as a key, especially for people of color. It's really critical. And, there's the pipeline still has a lot of work to bring people up through through those rungs for people of color. We have one more question we can take. And I think this is a good wrap-up question. For someone interested in joining a board, what is the first steps? Where should they get started? Now, I know, Shellye, you talked about it a little bit, but maybe you want to wrap on focus on this.
Sure. I mean, the first step, if you think you want to serve on a board, is do your homework. And I use homework. I mean, I still do my homework. Homework doesn't end when school's over, right? Homework means just getting prepared, doing the research. So the first step is do the research. Find out, what are boards looking for? What are the skill sets? What are the experiences, et cetera? Then look at your own background and compare and contrast it. Are there areas that you need to strengthen? Is there experience you want to go get? Work on getting it. If you see great matches, wonderful. Now you want to start talking to people about the fact that you're interested in serving on a board. And that's executive recruiters, but it's also people who are also around other board members. And that, by the way, is not just people who serve on boards. It can be people in the accounting field, in the legal field, because guess what? Lawyers and accountants, but they're in boardrooms as well. All of those folks can indeed be helpful. So you build that overall network. But when you're sharing that you're interested, just one quick thing, Noe, and I'll shut up, and that is, don't just say, I'm interested in serving on a board and I can do everything. Because remember, boards look for certain skills. And if you say everything, they're not going to associate a skill set with you. So be specific. I'm an executive with strong international expertise, building SaaS companies, right, in whatever, healthcare. Fine. Now, when people hear about a healthcare board that's interested in somebody with software, they're going to think of you. So be specific.
Shellye, bang
Joe,
on.
the great advice. Joe, you want to add to that?
No, bang on. And Shellye mentioned earlier the board skills matrix, right? If you look at public companies, you can find the skills matrix for most companies in their 14A, in their proxy statement. And if you start looking at enough skills matrices, you'll see the different types of skills that boards are looking for. And then you can start, as you play your own background, you can start thinking about what skills, what are the boxes that you tick, right? And the other thing to think about is people can't help you if they don't know, right? So yes, be very intentional in talking to folks and letting them know what your intention and what you think you bring to the table. But also, there are a number of programs at business schools run by nonprofits, run by Catalyst, that are designed to train people that are interested in serving on a board, helping them get board ready. One of my favorites is run out of Santa Clara Business School. It's called the Black Corporate Board Readiness Program. And they also run a program for women called the Women Corporate Board Readiness Program. And these are 4 to 6 week boot camps where they'll walk you through being a public company director 101. And they're great programs. You might find them at your local business school to be able to get additional skills as you prepare yourself for board service.
Well, this is great advice, and I think we could continue to talk about this for a long time. But I want to say that, I really appreciate you sharing your experience, your wisdom, and, we really covered a lot of topics here. So thank you so much for spending the time, Joe and Shellye, and for all you do and for being great role models for the Black community. And today when we're celebrating Black History Month. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine, and thanks to Catalyst.
Thank you, Lorraine. And to those watching, if you find me on LinkedIn, hurdthird@gmail.com, I'm willing to help anybody that I can. This is all of our effort to make this happen. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you.